Welcome back, everybody. We're in week 6 now and moving right along with everything. So, chapter 6 is called The Great Divide, and this one is mostly about this topic of pictorialism, which we'll dig into, but we do have some other major developments that are sprinkled throughout as well. So I'm going to try to touch on all of the significant information in this chapter with you all today. We are seeing a lot of attention being paid to photographs of modern life, further developments in science and its relation to photography, and particular growth in the realm of mass media and how photography was being used to represent current events in a very sensational way. So let's start with the mass media and mass markets. And the topic of illustrated newspapers. So illustrated newspapers were always popular from the time that you could put images on paper, right? But for most of history, you had to use engravings to share those images, right? Even when photography was first invented, we've talked about this constantly, it feels like, throughout these first few chapters. They would have to hire an engraving artist, or they'd have someone on staff to translate the photographs into engraving so they could easily and affordably be printed in these publications. But the illustrated newspapers and magazines, those start to become more and more popular and more ubiquitous because of the evolving photographic printing methods. So I have some examples here of some different ones, and there's countless ones. If you look up illustrated newspapers, you'll find hundreds and hundreds of images and archives of these things, but they were all over the globe, right? They weren't just in Europe, they weren't just in the United States. It was truly a global phenomenon at this time. So here's one from London, the Illustrated London News. You can see on this one that we have an engraved rendering of a photograph here. Here's the Daily Graphic. This one you can see has also engraved imagery on it with a little bit of hand coloring done. One that was really popular that we'll talk about next week a little bit further, or maybe not next week, but next time a little bit. In news, this one was quite popular, and here you can see there's an actual photograph on the front, which is kind of exciting. So the first big development in the 1880s was this half-tone printing process. And this process is what finally allowed for photographs to be directly reproduced into publications, as opposed to using the engravings or other methods of illustration that were used before. And this was huge, right? Huge news. We hadn't been able to do this before. Here's an example of one of these illustrated magazines kind of opened up, and you can see that you've got photographs on the left page, but an engraving on the right. So there's still some sort of combination effort happening here as well. But just to emphasize, if you recall, prior to this half-tone process, if you wanted an image to be included in a book, a pamphlet, an advertisement, a newspaper, a magazine, anything printed, it either had to be translated to an engraving to be printed, or the photographs would have to be individually printed using one of those methods associated with the calotype, and then hand pasted into the publication. And that's just not an efficient way of working, right? If you remember the Talbot's Pencil of Nature book, those had hand pasted photographs in it, and that's just not an economical way of working in order to make any money off of what you're doing. So both the methods of engraving and hand pasting photographs were incredibly painstaking processes and were not cost effective at all. So the big question is then, what is the halftone process? Now, if you Google it, you're going to get a whole bunch of videos showing you how to create a halftone in Photoshop, or they will discuss this method in its relation to screen printing, which is another printmaking method we didn't cover in our before photography conversation, but it's still something that's used by many artists today for making, works on paper, T-shirts are screen printed sometimes, but this method was used for creating photographs and text on the same page in a really economical way. So you can see from this image here, the halftone process used dots to create this illusion of gradation with images. It's something of an optical illusion, really, that leads your eye to believe it's seeing the delicate gradations of a photographic image, but it's being printed with all of these meticulously placed tiny dots to render the image in print. So now that you kind of have an idea of how the halftone process worked, we have to discuss why it was so important. So the halftone process was first and foremost cheap, right? Not like it wasn't expensive, because it still costs money to do it. But compared to all of these other methods that came before, or the other option of hand printing these photographs and pasting them in every single publication, it was super affordable. It was also easier and faster to use halftones than to hire artists to render engravings and other illustration methods for those illustrated newspapers. So the halftone process was just one of the many things that kick off this topic of industrialization that parallels the development and evolution of photography during this time period. Because it was easier and cheaper and faster, this also meant that publications would be hosting more and more images, right? You could put, if something's cheaper and faster, you can include more of it, right? So before the halftone process, there's much more text included in all publications, not just, the ones that were focused on illustration. So what we have now is more images and less text. So with this demand for more images to be included in publications, more and more photographers are being sent around the world to places where they think news is going to happen, something newsworthy, something worthy of having a photographer present to capture the image might happen. And if there's a possibility that something big could happen, they would send multiple photographers and they would go and capture what was going to happen. The sort of caveat here is that even though publishing houses and producers could send the photographers out to get these desirable images, the transmission process had not yet caught up to how quickly the images could be captured and printed for this time period, right? Photographers, like our cameras and our films, are still not as fast as they are today. They're not even close. But it's still easier for them to get images than it was in 1839, when we're just getting the daguerreotype and the calotype, right? So things are moving forward, but not as quickly in all areas as we would like. So what I mean about the transmission process is that if a photographer is in, say, San Francisco, but they're working for a newspaper out of New York, which this is the New York American, right? They're going to have to take that photo, develop it, print it, and send it back to New York to be printed, which, if you think about it, we still don't have cars. Mail goes by horses, so it's a slow process. We don't yet have we're not wired, right? There's not telephones yet, so you can't wire an image anywhere. So we're still working through this kind of disconnect between how quickly we can get the image and how quickly it can then be printed to share as news. So I like to use this example from your textbook here, because not only does it try to show you the halftone process by kind of zooming in on that little piece of the image there, you see it in the little circle, but it's also an example of an image that may take a long time from the time the event occurred until the public saw it in print. Now this one only took 8 days to be printed from the time the image was captured, but that was considered like lightning quick in those days. Sometimes it could take up to weeks or even months before an event would be printed and shared in a newspaper or illustrated publication. So you can kind of see the difference between how quickly information was shared in the 19th century versus today, right? But regardless of this lag time, this was groundbreaking that you could get an image and text in print like this during this time period. So press photography, working for newspapers and illustrated magazines, created full-time work for photographers, and the increasing popularity and demand for illustrated newspapers created an opportunity for more and more newspapers and magazines to be created. And this is why if you look up illustrated newspapers and magazines of the 19th century, you'll find so many versions of them. What this does is it also garners an atmosphere of competition for the most original pictures. Since there's now more photographers, it was not only about who could capture the event that was happening, the event that was newsworthy, but who could capture it in the most sensational and thrilling way. This competition caused photographers to begin to invade the privacy of public figures, which we would understand today as the paparazzi, right? And this is where it all began. This is where paparazzi came from. There's this publication called the Penny Pictorial Magazine, and they started running like a once a week or however often they published their illustrated magazine. They would run a feature called Taken Unawares, which is a weird thing to say, but it is the 19th century, so language is slightly different at this time. But these taken unawares are essentially like paparazzi shots, snapshots, right? Which we'll talk more specifically about snapshots in a little bit. But they're snapshots of famous people, sensational images, looking into the lives of the people that we don't get to see what they're doing all the time. So again, in this image from your textbook, it's the image of the shooting of Mayor Gaynor from 1910. And the photographer in this situation was sent out by his newspaper to capture images of the mayor leaving on his vacation, which is, pretty standard celebrity photographic assignments for the time. And as this photographer is William Warneke is the photographer, it says it on the screen there. But as William Warneke is taking these snapshots of the mayor, out of nowhere, this assassin comes out and shoots at the mayor. And so this photographer, simply being present at this site with his camera set up and ready to go, was able to capture this moment on film, and he truly caught a sensational image for his illustrated publication. So not only are photographers being sent out to act as paparazzi and take all of these images, the sensational images of celebrities, but if they're already out there and something wacky happens, they're set up and ready to go to capture these things that happen that you don't expect. The next sort of section of this illustrated newspapers is advertising, right? Advertising starts to increase as industrialization increases. So not only is industrialization running parallel to the evolution of photography, but folks in this area, in this field of advertising, are using photography to take advantage of industrialization and mass production of products, to make more and more advertisements to go in these illustrated publications. So advertising images create this culture of display. And what that means is that you're not only having to describe your product in words any longer. You can now use images to show people what these products look like or what you might look like using these products. So there's an increasing amount of advertisers using photography to sell the increasing amounts of products that were being mass produced more and more. And women were thought to have this great instinct for what products would succeed in the markets, as they were the ones who bought everything for the homes, right? The structure of the the household at that time was that the men went to work, the women took care of the household, and the women would make all of the purchasing decisions, right? So there were times that women would be sought out for jobs as copywriters and photographers. This wasn't a lot, mind you, but it was happening in some of the more progressive print houses because they were like, oh, well, the women know. And they're basically just selling to each other. So why not bring some of these women in to write the copy and make the photographs? And the great example that we have of that is the Tonneson sisters. So Beatrice and her sister Clara, they had a national advertising practice, which is like really unheard of for this time. They were actually based out of Chicago, and they were some of the very first advertisers to use photographs and live models, which gave them an advantage over those folks in advertising who were still using illustrations and engravings and things like that. So you can see here in this example that they have 3 photographs at the top for this marvelous new Spanish liquid for your hair. And apparently it makes any hair curly in 20 minutes. And you can see kind of towards the bottom of, like, there's still a lot of text here, right, describing what this is. It's not just doing it all in the images. There's still some growth that has to happen with, you know, using the image to kind of make the statement as we kind of understand it today. But if you look at the bottom, there's still 3 illustrations here showing some of the aspects of this curly hair, but they do have 3 photographs at the top. And you can imagine kind of how it would feel to all of a sudden see someone, a real person in a photograph with an ad, and you'd be like, oh my gosh, like, look at her hair. My hair could look like that. And that's so much more convincing than a drawing of someone, right? So we can start to see how photography assists in the growth of advertising and that sort of manipulation factor that comes in with advertising too. Like, you are like totally convinced by this image here. You can see kind of they're trying to lay out a timeline from left to right, right? So on the left you have the girl with the straight hair, and in the middle you have it all curled up, and at the very end on the right, this is what your hair will look like when you're all done in 20 minutes. And so that was just, you know, unheard of for this time. And so the Tonneson sisters really took advantage of their ability to use photography in their advertisements. So there's actually a website. Let me pull it up here. Share screen. Okay, so let me make sure it works. Is it gonna work? I think. Yep, here we go. So this is the website that's kind of that's dedicated to the Tonneson sisters, and if you're interested in exploring their work more, you can kind of get a pretty good idea of, you know, there's some of the photographs they did with the hand coloring. There's the image catalog that, if it loads here, we can see, you know, you can kind of click through and go through their story here. So introducing their models, the different collections, that kind of thing. So here's their section on advertising, actually, which is kind of great. So you can see it gives you little descriptions of each ad that they'd be doing, but especially for beauty products at this time, like, it was, you know, pretty exciting to like see what you could look like, or what you could aspire to look like by seeing a model as opposed to an illustration. So that link will be for you in the will be available for you in the Blackboard if you want to explore some of those advertising images a little bit more. Let me get back to our slideshow here. Okay, so That's the Thompson sisters, and here you just saw this on the screen there, and then this is like some of their other they also did like some art photography using their models as well, but a lot of it was very much focused on the growth of their advertising business. The next thing I want to talk about that really like helped everything move along more quickly was this dry plate process. So this, I think I mentioned it before. It's sort of similar to the wax paper process that we talked about a few weeks ago with that Gustave Le Gray came up with. But this made things so much faster and easier, more so than even before. We're still not quite to where we are today. We won't be there for a while, but like for the time, like this kind of thing was just so it was exciting because you could make it, all they wanted to do was make everything easier and faster, right? So the dry plates, you can see this image here. This is like a box of dry plates that you could order from a photographic company. And they were mass manufactured. They were pre-made for you as opposed to being made on site at the time the images were being made. And if we think about it, in 1839, exposures could take several minutes, right? We know Niepce's first permanent photograph took 8 hours, but you know, by the time they finessed it, it was still minutes for an exposure. But by the end of the 19th century, exposure time was reduced to like 1/5000th of a second, which was just like completely unheard of. These dry plates worked really well with the new smaller and more portable hand cameras that were also being manufactured around this time. And it allowed photographers to more easily record movement, and they could have greater mobility. And with that mobility comes anonymity. And if you have anonymity, you can sneakily take photographs. And that's particularly great for those paparazzi who are trying to take these very sensational images. So I do have a little video that'll tell us about the dry plate process, just so we can get a really solid grasp on what we're talking about here. So let me get that pulled up here for us. And we'll take a look at that. Again, all the links are going to be in the Blackboard. So if for whatever reason you're having issues with your audio, you can pause the lecture now and go pull up the link. Again, I know it's not ideal, but I just want to make sure that you can hear everything. So let's take a look at this dry plate process here.
The gelatin silver print comes really from the gelatin silver emulsion that's used for making what they call dry plates. Dry plates replaced the wet plate process in the 1880s. The act of making a silver gelatin emulsion is simply by taking gelatin, like the Jell-O that you buy in the store today, and you mix in a bromide and you mix in silver nitrate. This emulsion that you make can be put on paper, it can be put on plastic, it can be put on glass plates, it can be put on anything. It's the beginnings of modern photography.
Gelatin silver print is a developing out process rather than a printing out process.
Instead of an albumin print where you lay the printing frame out into the sun, when you make an image with silver gelatin emulsion, you just need a little bit of light.
You would enlarge the photograph from a smaller negative. Because the paper is so much more sensitive, you're able to do that without sunlight. You would start with a much smaller negative than with a contact printing method.
As time progresses, the negatives go from big things to small things because the cameras go from big things to small things.
You place a negative in an enlarger, you expose the paper. No image will appear when you have the paper exposed. It's called a latent image. Once you put the paper into the chemical bath, then the photograph appears.
Silver gelatin allows you to make black and white images. It is responsible for all the movies you've ever seen that were black and white, all the silent movies, all the sound movies. That's all silver gelatin. Gelatin silver is also responsible for color photography. During development, the silver releases dyes. And during fixing, you get rid of the silver, but the dyes remain. But all of the color photographs you've ever made, all of the ones that your family took while you were growing up, everything in the 20th century that was color had silver and had gelatin in that emulsion.
The modernists employed the gelatin silver print almost exclusively for its clarity, its sharpness, and the control over the print that you could get in the darkroom. These were not photographs that looked like paintings. These were photographs that looked like photographs. The black and white gelatin silver print became the norm in photojournalism. It was the standard way by which information from far away was produced in visual form and sent to be published in newspapers and magazines.
During the wet plate photographic process, most people would end up going to a professional photographer's studio. Most people couldn't afford to do that. In 1888, George Eastman came out with the Kodak camera.
This is the oldest known Kodak camera. It's called the Kodak. It's serial number 6, meaning it was the 6th one made. After all 100 exposures have been made, the camera will be shipped back to Rochester for processing and reloading. Shutter release is on the side. Still works. Not bad for a camera made in 1888.
The slogan, "You press the button, we do the rest," kind of said it all. It epitomized what he was trying to market, that you no longer had to be a professional and know the chemistry. You could actually do it yourself. Because the camera was smaller and easy to carry now, and people took their cameras everywhere, it opened up a field of photography for the general public, for anyone to capture all the different moments of their life. If there wasn't a gelatin silver process, none of what Mr. Eastman's company had done and had accomplished would ever have existed, because you wouldn't have had the snapshot cameras, you wouldn't have had the motion picture film and cameras. It wouldn't have existed without that particular base. I mean, that was the base of the company and their inventions for many, many years.
Okay. So we'll dig into the Kodak camera in a minute here. But let me get us back to our slideshow. And so you can see like that gelatin silver process, which is the technical name for the dry plate process, that really changed everything. It made a huge difference. And again, to emphasize that the dry plates, the gelatin silver plates that you would use in your cameras were mass manufactured, just like so many of the other products that we're talking about that they're using for advertising. So we are starting to see a world develop that is growing and changing rapidly with this industrialization and mass production that's sort of running right alongside the rest of the evolution here. The other process that comes up is the autochrome process. Now, this is a really early process for making color photographs. We don't yet have like a stable method for doing this. The autochrome process is not very stable, like the colors don't stay. So this is the sort of first stab at making actual color photographs where you're not hand coloring in. And what they would do is they would use dyed potato starch granules on a glass plate, which is then covered in light-sensitive emulsion, the same type of light-sensitive emulsion that's used for black and white photographs. And these grains would serve as color filters. And so the result of this would be a unique, direct, positive image. Basically, the autochrome was a slide that would require light to be passed through it so viewers could look at the image. It was really expensive to make, and it was really difficult to keep it from fading due to that sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here? That natural element, like the potato starch granules, that sort of starts to break down over time. But this autochrome process was the only color process that anyone tried to use before the actual Kodachrome film was invented in 1935. So we're still a little ways off from Kodachrome. We're still a ways off from 1935. But it's good to understand what the these early experiments were, because this is how you end up getting there, is through these processes. So again, I have a video about the autochrome process. So let's look at that to get a good handle on that process here.
When color photography comes out, people think of it as being very artificial at first. Serious, sincere, sort of authentic images were in black and white. After World War II, film for making color prints became available. People's associations with photography began to transform into color.
All silver-based photographic processes started out as blue sensitive. Blue and white photographed as the same value. So when you look at 19th century landscape photographs and you wonder, why didn't they have any clouds in those days? It's because the white of the sky and the blue of the sky photograph as the same value. In order to have color film, you must have black and white film that will record all colors. The sensitizing of emulsions was done by actually adding dyes to the liquid emulsion. So it's called dye sensitizing. Frederick Ives was instrumental in understanding that black and white film had to be dye sensitized in order to get a record from which you could make color images. It's really complicated. One of the earliest ways to make a color photograph was to make 3 negatives of the same scene. From the negative, make a lantern slide. Now, a lantern slide is a positive transparency, a slide. The positive slides were then put into 3 different projectors. The filter that was used to take that original negative was placed in front of the projector. When you projected these 3 different color images upon each other, it produced a full color image. Another way of doing an additive color plate is by having a transparency that is made up of either dots or lines using the red, the violet, and the green color. The dots that do the color mixing, they're so fine that you don't see them as dots, and they're so close to each other that they do their color mixing virtually by your eye. In England, James Clerk Maxwell did his initial experiments with the perception of color in the 1850s, and he came up with an interesting way of demonstrating additive color mixing. This is Maxwell's color wheel, and it's an additive color mixing machine. If you look at your iPhone with a loupe, or your television screen, or your computer screen with a loupe, get in very close, you'll see the same red and violet and green dots or lines.
The autochrome was invented by Auguste and Louis Lumière, the first process that could be manufactured and made available to the public. The Lumière brothers are probably best known for the invention of the motion picture camera. The autochrome is, like the daguerreotype, a process that produces a single positive image, a one-of-a-kind image. However, it's a transparency, so you have to view it through transmitted light.
And so the autochrome, the Joly plate, these early additive screen plates enabled people to take a picture in their camera with a single plate that allowed the finished product to be something you can hold in your hand, hold up to a window, and see a full color image. The other way of making a color photograph is by the subtractive method. Subtractive color processes are done by using magenta, yellow, and cyan images which are physically layered on top of each other. Chromogenic color photography was invented in the 1930s, and the process that really ushered in this entire movement of color was the Kodachrome process. It really begins with the work of Mans and Godowsky at the Kodak Research Labs. Chromogenic color prints are made with a gelatin emulsion. It's based on silver. and there are many layers. When the film or the paper is being developed, each layer releases the dye that it needs on the cyan, the yellow, or magenta layer. During the processing, the silver is actually removed, leaving only the color behind. And so you end up with a full color picture that was made with light going into the paper or onto the film simultaneously. It is rocket science. And so the chromogenic color process becomes the predominant process used throughout the 20th century, and it's still being used today. But those wheels are starting to slow down. Once chromogenic color is gone, we will never, ever see it happen again, because it requires an incredible infrastructure. Once it's gone, it's gone.
Okay. So I feel like that gives you a good handle on kind of seeing how those things work, you know? It's so hard sometimes because, like, we're not in person and the textbook doesn't, it'll describe this to you in words, but I feel like you have to kind of see how this works to fully understand kind of the labor that goes into these early processes, because, you know, this is the foundation for how photography exists today. And, you know, it took a lot of experimentation even to get to color, which we're not there yet in our conversation, but you can kind of see that that video leads you into like what happens after we do actually get color photography, and, you know, how that changes throughout the 20th century. And now, you know, almost everything is digital. So, in the video on the gelatin silver print, they kind of touched a little bit on the Kodak camera, right? And Kodak is a name that everyone should recognize because it's sort of synonymous with photography. So in 1888, the Eastman Dry Plate Company in New York starts manufacturing the Kodak camera. And this is important because, as they said in that video, it was the first camera that was intended for just sort of like casual use, and it was affordable, right? So this is sort of when I talk about the democratic potential that photography had. I brought this up when we were talking about the cyanotypes, the blue pictures that anyone could take. This really grabs hold of that strongly. Now, that camera has a fixed focus. Here, let's pull up this. This is the same ad they showed you in that video. It has a fixed focus, right? You don't have to focus it on anything. It just has one focal length. So this means that, you know, you're not using those giant cameras that we've been looking at this entire class so far, where you have to focus the lens through the viewfinder, make sure that nothing's blurry. The photographer doesn't have to do that. So already it really is, you press the button, we do the rest. With the Kodak camera comes the roll film. So George Eastman and his crew of scientists invented the roll film. If you remember, before this, everything's like single plates or single negatives, right? You put one copper plate into the camera, you put one piece of paper into the negative, or into the camera. Where are my words today? Now it's loaded, it's preloaded with a roll, and there's 100 exposures on it. So basically, you order your camera, your Kodak camera, from the Eastman Company. It comes to you in the mail with 100 images in it, right? 100 exposures in it. You go and with your fixed focus, you push the button, turn it to the next one, push the button, turn it to the next one. Once they're all used up, you no longer have to have like a darkroom. You don't have to have a knowledge of chemistry or really anything scientific, because you just send this whole box back to the Eastman Company. They take your film out, they process it for you, they print it for you, and then they reload your camera. And in the mail, you get back your camera with 100 new exposures in it and all of your prints and negatives from the previous exposed roll. So Kodak had essentially invented this customer-friendly photo business as well as an extremely uncomplicated camera, which is pretty incredible. And so this entices people to carry this camera with them and take all of these kind of more spontaneous images than had ever been taken before. Here's an example of the Brownie image. So in 1900, Kodak launches the Brownie camera, and this one is starting to be marketed toward children. So they're saying, like, it's so easy, like even children can use this camera. And here's another advertisement. They have so many advertisements for these different Kodak cameras. And then, of course, you have the different ads that they make that feature the Kodak girl. And she's always wearing like new fashionable outfits, holding a different version of the camera. This one that she's got in this image here has bellows on it, but they're still easy to use, right? So these Kodak cameras would take images in a circular format, and the very first original Kodak images were 2.5-inch circles, and then the next one that came out made 3.5-inch circles. And so they started to call them snapshots because they sort of looked like a snap, like a button on a shirt or something that you would snap. But also because you would snap the camera and take these pictures. And so all these snapshots that were being taken were mostly personal pictures, but they had a really big impact on the public. What happened when everyone is able to take photographs? Almost everyone, right? It reduces the number of professional portrait photographers that exist, because now you don't have to go pay a photographer in their studio to have your portrait done. You can take your Kodak or your Brownie and make a really informal picture in your home or in your yard or at the beach or in a boat, anywhere. It also deepens this association between informality and photographic truth. So what does that mean? We talk about photography and the truth, and so folks start to think that formal images seem contrived. Posed images seem like something's going on there that's not truthful. But if you see a snapshot that someone took, well, that's a true representation of life. So when the public starts to put their trust in these more casual images, then the photographers who are working for the press, the newspapers, the illustrated magazines, etc., they start to make their images look more casual. So you're seeing the effect of life on the press. And then, of course, you have a few of the publishing houses would still have a couple of artists on staff, you know, who maybe used to do engravings and illustrations, but they don't really have a need for them anymore because now we have the halftone process. But they're still there. And so if these artists are still at these publishing houses, then they start to try to make their drawings and engravings look more sketchy, as if they're like done on the spot. So you're seeing this response of both photographers, like professional photographers and professional artists working for publications. You're seeing them kind of try to emulate the look of the snapshot and now bring that into news reporting, which is kind of fascinating to see, you know, the back and forth of that. Like what's informing the different aesthetic output here. So Kodak essentially changes the face of photography through all of these points that I'm trying to make here. So that's sort of the gist of Kodak. The next thing I like to sort of touch on briefly, just because it's kind of fun, is this postcard craze. And because postcards weren't always a thing, right? Postcards become a thing after there's these changes in the 19th century postal regulations. And this happens in Europe and the United States. And so you're allowed now to send through the mail a very simple card with a message to be mailed. So you no longer have to send a formal letter, you can just send a little note. And what makes this doable, in tandem obviously with the post office making some changes, is the halftone process facilitates this reproduction of pictures and texts. So it makes it easier and faster to reproduce photographic postcards. And so the postcard becomes like the new carte de visite. People are collecting postcards, they're sending postcards to each other, and there's all kinds of different types of postcards being made in the same way that we saw all kinds of different cartes being made, all kinds of different stereographs. This is another thing that becomes kind of a craze for people to collect. So, you'll see tourist spots, you'll see news events, you'll see, different scenery, portraits, the kind of ethnographic types of images that we looked at. You'll see those. You'll also see erotic images coming up in postcards as well, because as we saw last week with the woman talking about the pornography of progress. Pornography does provide this stream of capital into all things. So you'll see that come up in postcards as well. But the ones that I like to share are these ones that William H. Martin did, the exaggeration postcard. And so those are the ones I'm going to show you today just because they're super fun. But you'll see here on the screen, this one says taking our geese to market, and he has made really large geese that are bigger than the men who are sort of corralling them here. And here's another one, harvesting a profitable crop of onions. And you can see it, it's not flawless by any means, and it was never intended to be, but it's this wonderful humor being brought in here that it's pleasant and it's enjoyable and it's sort of haha funny kind of a thing. And I've got a couple more that I really like. So again, like I said, the halftone printing process, it's allowing for him to do these exaggerations really cheaply and quickly and get them out to folks to use. The popularity of postcards did fade after World War I, mostly because there were new postal regulations that came up that kind of discouraged it. But I mean, today we still collect and send different postcards. Some people do. I don't know. I still see it happening a lot. It's particularly fun now because you can go into like thrift stores or antique shops, and you can find a lot of the old postcards, and they're all so goofy. Whether you're picking something up from the 1990s or the 1890s, they're all just so weird, and if they don't have any writing on them, they're pretty fun to fill out and send in the mail, especially since we don't do too much mail anymore these days. So that's my little nod to the postcards. I find them so charming. All right. So next, we're moving into the challenge for art photography, specifically naturalistic photography. And this part of your text can get a little confusing because the way that they're writing about, Peter Henry Emerson and his work, it's just not clear like what point they're trying to make here. So I'm going to try to simplify this in a way that you can say, okay, Emerson, I get him. Because I don't know, whoever edited this portion of the textbook, I'm like, it must have been like 1 a.m. or something when you were doing that. So Peter Henry Emerson, he had this idea, and he has two ideas that are conflicting, but he starts off with this idea that in the modern world, which is this time period that they're in the 19th century right now, science was the only authentic basis for art and photography. What does that mean? Well, he doesn't think there should be much of a creative approach to photography. So you can see again that there's throughout the history of photography, folks are trying to kind of figure out what photography is for, right? What is its purpose? And what are the rules that should surround it? Because, everything should have rules. And so he's sort of trying to define it and bring up this set of rules and write this, theory about why these rules should exist. And he reads a lot from this German scientist, Hermann von Helmholtz, who had done a lot of studies about the human eye and the range of focus that we can have with our human eye. And Emerson kind of clings to this theory that, we should see things the way the human eye sees them. So he writes this book called Naturalistic Photography, where he's rejecting art and personal expression through photography. Again, he doesn't like imaginative things. He thinks it's too untrue and that photography is a tool for the truth. So what he thinks is that with photography, you should take a photograph that translates the world exactly how the eye sees it. So the photographer should focus on the main subject of the scene. For example, the image on your screen now, right? The only thing that's truly in focus here is the woman in the foreground. Everything else is kind of blurry. And that's how our eyes see things, right? Like if you're looking at the screen right now, if you're looking right at that woman, she's the only thing in focus. Everything else in the photograph, everything else on your screen, everything outside your screen is peripheral and blurry. That's how our eyes focus on things. So Emerson calls this differential or selective focus, which was different than making the entire image out of focus, right? He's not making the whole image blurry. He's just saying that when you focus your lens, you focus on the main subject that you want to focus on, and everything else will then be rendered how the eye sees it. I hope that makes sense. It gets just so tricky, again, to do in words when I'm not able to flail about in front of you and show you these things. So the other thing that he strongly believed in was that the tones in the photograph could be manipulated to a much greater degree than chemists could prove possible. So he was very much focused on scientific elements about translating how the eyes see and the sort of tonal capabilities of the photographic emulsion, whether it was the paper it's being printed on or the negatives that you're making the photograph on. But with Emerson, he's focused so much on building this theory around what a photograph should be. And then of course over time we get to this point where he makes he does the naturalistic photography. He's hell-bent on that being how photography should exist, how it should work, what it's for, what its purpose is, what its rules are. And then years later, he creates another publication that's called The Death of Naturalistic Photography. And that publication just completely contradicts everything that he wrote about in naturalistic photography. So, eventually he gets to a point where he's like, okay, no, I was wrong. And then he writes this other book. So if you're interested in Emerson, in digging into him further, you can seek out those publications and kind of dig into how he really goes on this whole roller coaster ride throughout his life. But that's the gist of Emerson, the general idea of what he's up to there. this leads us into our discussion on pictorialism, which is a very important topic. So if you recall, with Emerson, he's focused on the selective focus of the eye, right? Where at least one thing is in focus and everything else is blurry. Pictorialists were doing something where they kind of adopted some of Emerson's tactics of selective focus. And you'll kind of see how that works as I go through some of the images and we talk about it. But pictorialists, at their core, had a real strong response, and it was a negative response, to industrialization and mass-produced goods. They were anti-industrialization. They did not believe in it. They thought it was going to ruin society, which, I mean, we could get into talking about that and how that exists today, but that's sort of another topic related, but not related to what I want to talk about right now. So it's important to remember that they had this sort of very raw response in which they were very against industrialization and mass-produced goods. So what they were doing in their photographs is they would use some of Emerson's tactics of selective focus as a way of kind of expressing their dislike of commercial photography. So again, just to emphasize, because I know this can get confusing, the pictorialists did not like industrialization. They did not like this idea of mass-produced goods. They did not like the commercial photography that was kind of piggybacking on the opportunity to sell these goods, right? They were anti-advertising. What they did was they really liked to create these more natural scenes with fog and shadows, and they were really working towards that tonal complexity that Emerson was describing. You'll see a lot of soft middle gray tones. They wanted to use their hands in this process. So not only would they take a negative in their camera, and then maybe they would process it and take it out and scratch into it or put something on top of it before they printed it, but maybe they took their pure negative, printed it, and then they would do some handwork on the actual print. What happens then is you get these photographs that are in direct opposition to the very sharp and black and white clear contrast of commercial prints. Sometimes they would print on textured paper, like watercolor paper, so that they could make their images kind of resemble soft paintings. And they chose this type of paper specifically because commercial photographers would use glossy paper to print their advertisements to make them look more slick, right? So let's just go through a few of the photographers, and I picked mostly ones that are shown in your book this time because there are some really wonderful examples. So this is one by Jane Reese. She's a commercial portraitist in Ohio, and she's sort of working with, she has this interest in old Japanese printmaking techniques, and so she tries to bring that into her photographs. And this one looks like it is quite clear, but it still has that soft look. She's purposefully flattening the space, and she's trying to bring this beauty into the image, something that you wouldn't necessarily think about in an image that's trying to sell you something, right? Like this type of image is asking you to experience it. It's not trying to sell you a flower or a dress or a hairstyle or anything like that. The next one is George Davidson, and his work is particularly important because he was interested in this idea of impressionistic photography, and impressionistic photography sort of falls in line with impressionistic painting. If you remember the Monet haystack that we looked at a few weeks ago, Monet with his haystacks and his water lily pictures and all of those types of things, he was an impressionistic painter, right? And so there's something called the Impressionism movement, which is capturing this visual imprint of a scene that happened in a moment, right? If you remember, I showed you all those different haystacks, different times of day, different seasons. They're capturing like a feeling in a moment. And impressionistic photography, while sort of part of the Impressionism movement and the pictorialism movement, was more about rendering this personal response to a subject. So topics like poetry, poetic art, naturalistic, impressionistic, all of those kind of topics fell under this umbrella of pictorialism. And a lot of times I would see images made by pictorialists, they would be like, oh, it's fuzzy, right? And your textbook talks about the fuzzy graph. And that is kind of a wonderful way to describe a lot of these pictorialist images because they're not in, direct focus. They are fuzzy and they're after that very atmospheric quality, that hand-worked quality. And that's kind of exciting because up until this point, up until, 10 minutes ago when I was talking about, the advertising images, right? Photographers and scientists they're striving to create a camera that can capture and freeze movement, right? And the pictorialists were like, we want nothing to do with that. We like the fuzzy look of it. We want this sort of dreamy, sort of like if you have a memory of something, that's how they want to render the photograph, is as if you're remembering something from a dream or from a long time ago, and that always ends up rendering as fuzzy. But the sort of ironic thing that happens with pictorialism is that, as I said, all the pictorialists are kind of anti-industrialization, mass production, anti-commercial. But once they start putting their images out in the world, the commercial producers were like, oh, people are responding to this. They go out and they make soft focus lenses and textured photographic papers that are then mass produced and sold to photographers so that they don't have to do the same amount of work that the pictorialists are doing. So there's this irony that the pictorialists are anti-mass production, and then the commercial producers were like, oh, well, let's make money off of this. So again, you're seeing that element of the evolution of photography where they're like, oh, we can make more money if we do this. We can make more money if we do this. So that's going to continually happen as we go through here. But I have a few other pictorialist photographers that I want to share with you, as well as some of the processes that they use, so you can kind of see how much work really went into creating these images and the labor that they put in to express themselves, not only using photography, but kind of this art quality that came along with it. So this is, again, from your textbook by Robert Dimaschi, and he uses the gum bichromate process, and that's where you're kind of adding pigment into the prints, and you can see the gesture of the brush that he's using to kind of outline the body here. So let's watch this video on this pigmenting process so we can kind of get a grasp on the pictorialist process here. Let's see, I have to get to the video. It's this one. Okay.
the major themes in photography is this desire to have a more permanent image. You have the Woodbury type, you have the platinum print, very stable, very long-lasting processes. Then you also have the pigment family of processes, the gum bichromate process and the carbon print process.
The gum print is based on the light sensitivity of chromium. Mungo Ponton is the first person to really do experiments with the light sensitivity of this compound. Talbot himself experiments with chromium salts. He discovers that if you mix them with colloids, gelatin or gum, they harden when they're exposed to sunlight. Based on the work of Talbot, it doesn't take too much time for people to figure out that if we take a colloid like gum arabic and we put pigment into those, and then we sensitize those with chromium salts, we now have a medium that can be brushed onto paper, exposed to light under a negative. When we put this piece of paper in warm water, areas that are struck by light will harden, and that's where the dark pigment will be, and areas that are not struck by light will dissolve away, leaving the white of the paper. And so now we have a brand new printing process based on chromium. If you look at a gum print, the darker the picture, the thicker the deposit of gum. And the whiter the picture, the more you're getting towards the actual paper. So the image itself will have slight relief. One of the names that's associated with gum printing and carbon printing is Alphonse Poitvin, a Frenchman who perfects certain elements of chromium printing. While it's imperfect, is the seed to an improvement that's later done by Joseph Swan that results in this process we now call carbon printing. It's essentially a piece of paper that's coated with gelatin that is bearing pigment. This thing is called the tissue. It's not tissue-like at all. It feels like a piece of plastic. The tissue is sensitized with chromium, is contact printed with a negative. The light striking the gelatin hardens the gelatin selectively. That tissue now is put into cold water. A second piece of paper bearing clear gelatin on the surface is put in contact with the tissue. They're slid into a tray with hot water. The unhardened gelatin with pigment ooze out the edges. It's softening because of the hot water. You peel off the original tissue